So, the story of the United States. Wow, it's a massive one, right? We're talking over 15,000 years of history here. In this explainer, we're going to take a journey from the continent's very first inhabitants all the way to the global superpower we see today. We're going to try and figure out, how did it all happen?
And really, when you think about it, that whole journey boils down to one central question. How does a small collection of colonies, just kind of clinging to the edge of a huge continent, manage to turn itself into one of the most powerful and influential nations in all of world history? Well, let's dive in and find out.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the story of America, we have to start way, way before any European ships ever showed up. We have to begin with the people who first called this land home. The first thing that just jumps out at you here is the incredible scale of time. We're talking 15,000 years. For all that time, really diverse and complex cultures were thriving all across this continent. That Viking landing in 1000 CE, it was barely even a blip on the radar. No, it was Columbus's arrival in 1492 that was the real game changer. That's what kicked off this massive European rush to a land that, well, for the people already living there, wasn't new in any way, shape, or form.
But here's the thing, not all the European powers showed up with the same game plan. You had Spain, and they were mostly focused on one thing: getting rich. They wanted to extract wealth, gold, silver, you name it, from their colonies down in South and Central America. England's approach up in the north? Totally different. They came to stay. Their goal was to build permanent settlements where people could live, work, and build a whole new society from the ground up.
So this whole coming-to-stay strategy is what led to the 13 English colonies. And each one kind of developed its own unique personality. Up north in New England, the economy was all about small farms, fishing, and forests. Then you had the middle colonies, which became known as the breadbasket because they produced so much wheat and grain. And then there was the South. Down there, a huge plantation economy took root, depending on cash crops like tobacco and cotton. And this is absolutely crucial. That economy was tragically built from the ground up on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. It's a fact that would, not long after, literally tear the nation apart.
But, for all their differences, these three very distinct regions eventually found some common ground, and it was on one single, crucial issue. They were just done. They were tired of being ruled by a king who was an entire ocean away.
And things escalated surprisingly fast. Britain started imposing all these new laws and high taxes. But the colonists had zero say in any of it. No representatives in the government making the rules. This led to that famous rallying cry, right? No taxation without representation. That frustration just kept building until it boiled over into open defiance, like the Boston Tea Party. And just like that, by 1775, the whole thing exploded into the American Revolution.
Then comes 1776. The colonists declared their independence with a document that would, and this is no exaggeration, change the world. It was built on this incredibly radical idea that all people are created equal and are born with certain rights that no government, no king, nobody can take away. You gotta remember, for a world that was run by kings and emperors, this was a completely revolutionary concept.
But this brings us to probably the most critical and painful question in all of American history. When the founders wrote, "All men are created equal," who did they actually mean? Because let's be clear, at that moment, those profound, world-changing rights, they did not apply to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, they didn't apply to women, and they certainly didn't apply to the Native Americans whose land was being taken from them.
And this is the fundamental contradiction, right? A nation that's dedicated to freedom, but at the same time is practicing slavery. This paradox would define America's entire next chapter. A century of just incredible expansion, but one that was constantly shadowed by this unavoidable and ultimately violent division.
So what fueled this massive push westward? It was a powerful idea called manifest destiny. This was basically the belief that the United States was destined, by God, its supporters believed, to stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This idea drove settlers across the continent, for sure, but it came at an absolutely terrible cost. It led to the violent removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands through things like forced marches and just one broken treaty after another.
And as the country got bigger, that deep, deep division over slavery just grew right along with it. The contrast was just so stark. In the North, you had this booming industrial economy and a growing abolitionist movement that was calling slavery out for what it was, a profound moral evil. Meanwhile, in the South, the entire economy was almost completely dependent on the labor of enslaved people. The leaders there argued that their whole way of life would just collapse without it. Something had to give. These two versions of America, they just couldn't coexist. In 1861, the conflict finally erupted into the Civil War. It would last for 4 incredibly bloody years, and it's still the deadliest war in American history. Just a brutal, tragic conflict of a nation literally at war with itself. Now, the war left some deep, deep scars that lasted for a long time. But its end also marked the beginning of a just staggering transformation. In the decades that followed, America was going to be reforged, really, into a modern world power. Okay, so this huge transformation really happened on 3 fronts. First up, machines.
The Industrial Revolution just exploded. All of a sudden, factories are remaking the landscape, railroads are stitching the entire continent together, and new technologies like, electricity are changing daily life forever. Second, people. All these new industries needed workers, and that sparked these massive waves of immigration. Millions of people arrived from all over the world, drawn by the promise of the American dream. That powerful idea that if you just worked hard enough, you could build a better life for yourself. And finally, number 3, war. Global conflict forged a brand new identity for the nation. America's immense industrial power turned out to be the deciding factor in 2 world wars. And by 1945, the transformation was complete. It went from being a pretty isolated nation to a dominant global superpower ready to shape the rest of the 20th century. Which brings us, at last, to today. The American story is obviously far from over, and right now it's really defined by this complex mix of incredible strengths on one side and some really persistent, difficult challenges on the other. And that core struggle we talked about, the struggle to actually live up to the nation's founding ideals, well, it never went away. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was this incredibly powerful fight to finally make the promise of equality a reality for Black Americans. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. put it so perfectly. It was a demand for the country to finally honor its own creed. And that fight, well, it continues in new ways to this very day. So, if you're going to take away one thing about modern America, it's this. It's a nation of contrasts. You can almost think of it like a balance sheet. On the one hand, its diversity is a massive strength, but on the other, it's still dealing with the legacy of racism. It has the world's largest economy, for sure, but it also struggles with huge income inequality. And yeah, it's a leader in culture and innovation, but it's also facing some really deep political divisions and tricky problems like healthcare. And all of this really brings us back to a pretty fundamental idea. The American experiment, it's not a finished product, not at all. It's an ongoing story, one that's constantly being rewritten by new generations who are facing new challenges. Which of course leaves all of us with the ultimate question: what's the next chapter going to be?